I'm your host, Michael Callahan. This is Where We Go Next. And our beliefs shape our reality, influence our decisions, and define our identity. But what if the convictions that guide us aren't as solid as we think? Is it possible to navigate life without a belief structure, or are we all, in our own way, guided by a faith in something larger than ourselves? From joining secretive cults to experimenting with alternative medicine, our guests this week bring a skeptical yet open-minded approach to uncovering the truth. Carrie Poppy and Ross Blocher are the hosts of Oh No, Ross and Carrie, a beloved investigative podcast with over 500,000 downloads monthly. Now, I tried to come up with a snappy way to describe it, but I honestly can't beat the show's intro, so I'm just going to steal it. Quote, the show where we don't just report on fringe science, spirituality, and claims of the paranormal, but take part ourselves. When they make the claims, we show up so you don't have to. Carrie, Ross, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Mike. Glad to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Well, I'm glad that it's a pleasure all around. Now, you've done ayahuasca in Costa Rica, been baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and the Raelian Church, firewalked, sorry about your feet, Ross, ridden in an unmarked van deep into rural Southern California to investigate a cult led by an imprisoned child abuser. You've ghost hunted, taken part in an exorcism, and perhaps, most famously, done a deep dive ground floor investigation into Scientology. So the first question for each of you, what has been the strangest, and define that however you like, experience that you've had over the last 13 years of your show? Carrie, let's start with you.
Strangest is hard. People usually ask us what was the scariest, what was our favorite, but strangest is very hard to define once you're already in the context of our show.
Well, perhaps we can put a finer point on it. Was there ever a moment, and I imagine there were probably several, where you find yourself in the thick of it and think to yourself, what on earth have I gotten myself into?
Okay. Yeah. Then for me, that is the Tony Alamo Christian Ministries moment, which you mentioned. So this was a cult. I'm using the term advisedly here, but a cult in Southern California that was led by a man who is currently in prison while we were investigating them. And we needed to head out to their compound. And in order to do that, we had to get on this unmarked white van, just completely nondescript at the corner of Hollywood and Highland. And I just realized as we got in and they shut the door, like, oh man, how do we even describe this to our friends? If we need to send someone out for us, what do? We say it's a white van heading north on the 5? What are we even going to say? And honestly, actually, that's the time that I thought like, oh, we actually did it. We actually went too far. We have to roll it back.
How about you, Ross?
Yeah, boy, I'm trying to think because at some point you run out of superlatives. Just thinking of, oh, this is the weirdest, the strangest, because I think we constantly find ourselves in situations where I think now I've seen everything. But when you asked the question, I got two mental images immediately. And one was laughter yoga, which is not dangerous or scary, but just being in a room full of adults with squeaky toys and inflatable things, trying to make each other laugh. That certainly was strange. Just, okay, this exists and I'm here and I'm doing it. But also at the same time, I had the image of being under the influence of ayahuasca and realizing I am in Costa Rica. This is where I'm going to die? ? Because I really was convinced at that time that this was the end of me. And that was a bit of unwanted reflection for 6 hours that I was not ready for.
I saw the video of the two of you at like a dinner event for that laughter yoga, and it was deeply unsettling as a viewer.
Is that the one where we're wearing a bunch of hats?
You were all sitting around in a large group at tables, all dressed well.
Were we all wearing white?
Yes.
Oh, that was actually a reunion for the family cult.
It was on YouTube, and you were all laughing for like a minute straight.
Oh, yeah. I think they were practicing laughter yoga, but it was the family cult that was getting together, and they were calling themselves a cult. It was a multi-decade reunion dinner that we attended.
The Source family.
Ah.
Thank you. That's the word I was looking for.
Well, I guess if you're going to be a cult, wear the badge with pride.
Look at Carrie providing sources.
Are there any investigations you won't undertake, either because they seem too dangerous or just too freaky. Carrie, you've mentioned that you won't drink colloidal silver or take anything through an IV that isn't recommended by a doctor. But besides the things that immediately signal potential physical harm, like taking a substance into one's own body, is there any conspiracy or occult group or organization or mystery that you haven't covered, thought about it, but haven't done it because you're just too scared for your own safety? To put it another way, what have you decided was just a bit too oh no for both of you? We can start with you, Ross.
That's interesting because I always have thought, okay, I'd take a little bit of colloidal silver, but I'd stop before I turned blue because obviously you can survive the experience. That's funny. We're looking into one right now that I think Carrie has always been too uncomfortable to do. I'm looking into chiropractors. I've never done that before. And they'll do these quick neck adjustments. And the guy asked me for permission. And still, I was shocked when he snapped my neck as quickly as he did, cracked it. Obviously, my neck is not separated from my body now.
You are still alive.
Yeah. But I think that's one that Carrie said, I don't want to put myself in that situation where someone's going to quickly pivot my neck or do some alteration that damages my spine.
Yeah. I have gotten chiropractic before.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, because I get these migraines that have been chronic that come up on the show all the time. And I was trying to figure those out. And early on, someone said, oh, you should go to a chiropractor and see if it's spinal. So I did get a bunch of manipulations then, and I got my neck manipulated once. But then I learned that it's really dangerous and decided I would never do it again. So you get your one time, I get my one time, but never again for me.
Oh, I'll be eager to hear those stories in more detail. Okay, but things that I wouldn't do. I know there are like certain groups where maybe word has already gotten out about them. I think of Nexium. By the time we heard about it, we already knew that they had been branding women and that sort of thing. No, why would we go into it? We already have information about it from another source. They're already sort of exposed and wary of journalists. So that's the sort of thing where I'd be like, no, thank you. And of course, like you said, just bodily harm, permanent changes to one's body. We try to avoid those.
Yeah, perhaps you learned your firewalking lesson there.
Yeah, my foot is better now. Thank you.
Oh, that is good. That is good. It looked a little gnarly from that YouTube video. You were both at a book club meeting at the Center for Inquiry around 2009 and realized you had a shared love of The Simpsons and Fringe science. So what was the inciting incident? That's a theme I cover with a lot of folks on this podcast that took you from friends with similar interests to podcast hosts in 2011. Carrie, let's start with you.
Okay, well, here's a fun fact. It's actually, and everyone assumes that it must be that we were both Simpsons fans, but it's actually that we both recognized Simpsons quotes. Which reflected that Ross is a Simpsons fan and that my brain just collects quotes very easily and captures them and can tell you the source immediately. I wasn't like that into The Simpsons or anything, but we connected on this level, I think, of like people who, I don't know, kind of
have a shared language.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Have a shared language and have this sort of cataloging sort of mind. And then additionally, when we realized we're both really interested in fringe science and we're experiencers, we're not the people who want to sit and read the book and say, oh, that's nice. That sounds interesting. We want to read it and then we want to go do it. And among the book club, we were definitely the only two people who had that attitude about what we were reading.
Carrie had come to the book club suggesting that we go to this Kabbalah lecture, and she had, I think, a flyer from it. And everybody else's reaction was, why would we do that? We don't believe that sort of thing. That's why we're in a skeptics book club, which, by the way, I am now the lead of that book club, and I've been in it since 2006. So, wow, 18 years of book club almost.
Oh, wow.
My reaction was, well, why wouldn't we? What a cool opportunity that they're opening up a Kabbalah lecture. Usually that's known for being secretive, hidden. Count me in. That sounds great. I want to hear what they have to say about it. It was something to do with the horoscope or some sort of zodiacal thing. We went and we had a good time and we were enjoying it. We didn't believe any of it, but we thought it was really interesting to hear how they presented the ideas. Then when we came back to the next month's book club, everybody wanted to know. The conversation was hijacked by what happened. Give me a point-by-point recounting of what happened. And this is where I think we each individually had this revelation, this light bulb turn on that, oh, there's something here. People are interested in this, but they don't want to do it themselves. How weird.
Right. So you decided that you would have a podcast where you do it so they don't have to.
Exactly.
Carrie, how does this tie in to the experience you had in 2008? You were 25 years old, living in a tiny house behind someone else's house here in Los Angeles. One night you got a, quote, spooky feeling, like you were being watched. There was a pressure in your chest, quote, the feeling when you get bad news, end quote. You became convinced that something was there in your house haunting you. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
The quotes you listed were just beautiful. I just wondered who the source was. I had this really mystical seeming experience at the time where I thought that I was being haunted because I was having these inexplicable body experiences and psychological experiences. And that was kind of the explanation on offer, right? You feel spooky inside of your house is haunted. And a lot of people were supporting that explanation. I was going to various friends and saying, I think there's an entity in my house. And as soon as you say that, the culture goes, yeah, okay, sure. That's your narrative. We'll go along with that. So all my friends are now supporting it and saying, sure, okay, let's bring Sage over. I don't know. Carrie thinks that her house is haunted. Perhaps not even realizing how dire the situation was for me. But eventually things got so bad. I was so obsessed with what was going on and feeling these symptoms all the time that I went and Googled for more explanations besides ghosts and found this ghost hunting group that was run by quote unquote skeptics. And I posted in their chat. And I wish I knew which group this was. I've tried to go back and find it and I don't know. But I think it was some local group somewhere. Like I want to say they were in Colorado or something. Anyway, I said, hey, this is what's happening. Do you have another explanation for me? And someone said, well, first thing to rule out is carbon monoxide. And that's when I remembered that, oh my gosh, when I moved in, I remember there was a smell of gas, but it went away. And so I never thought about it again. And so I called the gas company and they came over and brought over a carbon monoxide detector, which my landlord had not provided, and said, oh, yeah, get out of here. There's a bunch of carbon monoxide in here. And I had to get my dogs out. And yeah, it was a very formative experience for me because I realized that, oh my goodness, this thing that had seemed completely spiritual to me had a totally different explanation. Once I put a spiritual label on it, everyone was happy to run with that. Oh man, so that means that there could just be endless experiences like this around the world of people having experiences they thought were paranormal and their friends and family and so on thought they were supporting them by supporting that explanation when they may have been in danger. So yeah, that's my personal entree into feeling very, very passionate about these topics.
And you share this story in your TED Talk, A Scientific Approach to the Paranormal, in which you also share a pretty shocking stat that 37% of people believe in ghosts. And you pose the question, how many of those people are actually suffering from carbon monoxide poisoning? So I guess what I'm really interested in is your respective paths from going from people who, to use your words, Carrie, quote, I used to be a believer. I was a believer in a lot of things. I was very religious. I practiced alternative medicine. I used energy healing. I once performed an exorcism. I believed I had psychic powers. I pretty much went through every wooey belief you can think of, end quote. And I'll start with you, Carrie, but I want to hear from you as well, Ross. What was that first moment out of this way of thinking for you, Carrie, that started you on the path to the person you are today?
To give a really honest answer, I think I'd have to go really deep into my life history before I was thinking in terms of skepticism or atheism or any of that. Even as a kid, I was definitely thinking on my own. When I was 4, my mom gave me bacon one morning and I asked her how they got it out of the pig. And she said, the bacon is the pig. This story has been told so many times that I know exactly how it goes. I slapped the bacon down and I said, never again. And she apparently said, that means you can't eat any of the animals, thinking she was stumping me. And I was like, great, I'll never eat any of the animals.
You're on, Mom.
And I haven't. It's 36 years later. I'm stubborn. I know what I believe.
I made a promise. I'm sticking to it.
Yeah. If I made an ethical commitment, well, gosh darn it. Even if I don't remember the story because I was 4, I'm doing it. That's really how I feel about it. Ethical matters, I think, just come down to where you stand deep inside yourself. So when you ask me this question, I go all the way back to childhood. I don't know where it begins.
I think you kind of have to go all the way back. I mean, you were both once evangelical Christians. Carrie, I think you became a Christian around the age of 13, 14, somewhere around there. And Ross, you were pretty deep in it pretty much your entire childhood, quote, singing in choirs, serving as an acolyte, and memorizing lots of scripture, end quote. Now, I relate to this. I didn't grow up evangelical myself. I was raised Presbyterian. But you and I had pretty similar faith journeys. Was there a pivotal moment, maybe a tipping point, when you lost your faith, or was it a gradual process? And how did your loss of faith influence your desire, to use your words, if you couldn't tell from this podcast, I like quotes, quote, to find out why people believe what they do?
Yeah. When you're raised in a faith tradition, the hardest thing that you have to define is when you started believing, because you don't want to just say, well, I was born into it. I came into this family. So you'd always try to find these little markers to sort of claim, this is where I decided for Christ. But I mean, this went into high school. Well, no, definitely high school. I was being taught 7-day creationism. I meant to say this was going into college, where I was the leader of the Bible study group, Living in God's Hands Today, or LIGHT for short. Very clever. I didn't come up with the name, but I was the second president of this group, and I would lead weekly Bible studies. But we had one science professor at the school. I was studying animation, but we had to take a couple science courses. And Dr. Philpack, shout out, had told me about this Skeptic Society that was meeting in Pasadena, and we could get extra credit if we went to the lectures. And I didn't need extra credit. I had a very good grade in the class, but the lecture titles, I remember looking at this flyer of upcoming lectures, and one was talking about like the frontiers of space. The other one was talking about the decline of the X chromosome. And I don't know, there was something about evolution, which I was already against. And I thought, well, let's go to this. And so I went to the lecture, and in the intro, they'd make little jokes about Christianity, and I'd sort of cross my arms and respond internally with Bible verses. But I was so fascinated that I went back again. And I think maybe this was the first indication of kind of my personality that persists through the podcast, which is I may disagree with you, but I want to hear you out. And I may have my own internal dialogue about what you're saying, but I'll hear you out. So I kept going back for a year and a half like that, and I would buy the books and I would read them. So you asked if it was a gradual process or if there was a moment. It's both. I always say conversions are fast and deconversions are slow. I think there are counterexamples to that, but it took a long time for me to start being aware of the arguments that I would be making internally. And they were all usually scriptural references, but I was becoming more aware of scripture that just didn't make sense or felt contradictory or just didn't seem ethical. And so my Bible studies at that time were mostly, let's help Ross get through some weird passage of the Bible that doesn't make sense. Like, why are they putting up this bronze snake? They were just told about the calf. They shouldn't be doing this. Why is it healing the people? This doesn't make any sense. This is a stupid story. And I'll say that moment was, it was spring break of 2004. So I was still in school, but we were heading back, and by we, I mean my wife and young son. I got married very early. I was 18 when my son was born. We're all fine now, still a happy family, so that all worked out. But I was driving by myself. We were in this little mini caravan heading up north to see family, and I was just wrestling with God the whole time. And it was peppered with little biblical allusions like, I know only a wicked generation asks for signs, God, but you did answer Gideon when he wanted to know whether there would be dew on the fleece or dew on the ground, and silly stuff like that. But you know I need more than this. I'm just going to try looking at the world as if you don't exist. But I promise, just like Carrie promises not to eat animals, I promise I will always remain open if you ever have words for me, if you ever want to speak to me, because you know what I need. And I remember then this moment where we stopped for gas, and I got out of my truck, And I had this physical sensation, like this kind of lurching in my stomach of almost the atmosphere pulling me up, because I realized, okay, there's a layer of atmosphere and then there's space and that's it. The world just seemed so frighteningly different to me in that moment that I felt like I had to like hold on to that little yellow, I don't know, a cement thing that keeps you from hitting the gas pump. And after that, the rest of the drive was this sense of relief as I started seeing the world in a very different way. Wow. Okay. So when something bad happens, it's not because I did something wrong or God is trying to teach me some lesson. It's because the world's just being the world, and it's not for me. It's not against me. It's just the world. It's indifferent. That's the long journey for me out of faith.
You had a passion for reading about the paranormal and UFOs and aliens when you were a kid, while you were also a believer, right? And it's interesting that we're able to hold both those things in our heads at one time. It kind of reminds me of a quote. I don't know who it was, but it might have been Ricky Gervais. Basically something along the lines of, everyone on earth is an atheist. It's just an actual atheist is an atheist for 100% of religions, and everyone else is an atheist for 99.9% of them. We're able to hold both those things in our head at the same time.
Absolutely. I think it's a human tendency to syncretize, to pull all these different faiths together and find ways for them to work so that we get all the pieces that we want. And we're very good at sectioning off our brains and not having that big of a problem when contradictory ideas lie next to each other. And only on occasion does reality force us to be aware of those contradictions and deal with them, and that's the whole study of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
Yeah, I easily found myself within that. And when I needed to, I would make little theories because I did want consistency, but I had my own theories about how aliens were probably demons in disguise, and it all worked out. I thought it was very clever.
I think something that perhaps the three of us also share in common, at least if this still applies from your TED Talk several years ago, Carrie, quote, every time I do one of these investigations, I still get so excited. I'm 75 into them, and still, I swear on number 76, I'm going to be like, this is the one. And maybe I'm just eternally optimistic, but I hope I never lose this hope, end quote. That was back in 2016. And I very much relate to that because I lost my faith with a kind of profound sadness. The personal essay that I wrote to get into grad school at USC was about the loss of my faith.
Represent.
Thank you. Yes, Trojans, Trojan Mafia.
Nice.
It was at that time, I was around 21, 22 years old when it happened. I kind of lost my faith. Like Hemingway says, you go bankrupt. It's like very slowly and then all at once.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
It felt like a fundamental piece of me, a fundamental descriptor in the same way that I'm 6 feet tall on a good day. Brown hair, brown eyes, Armenian, Irish, Christian was like this defining fundamental pillar of who I was as a person. And then all of a sudden to have that kind of removed felt like there was this hole inside of me. And I understand that optimism for whether it's related to, let's say, your investigations where you hope that maybe hope against hope, that this thing that seems like it's outside of reality or seems like it's impossible, at some point you just want one of these amazing things to actually be true. I deeply relate to that because I feel like I don't mean to get too dark, but sometimes I miss belief. I miss faith. Does that make sense?
Of course. Of course. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And I think people miss faith all the time. I think that's why people go back to religions. It's interesting when you were talking about that, I started thinking something about you repeating me back to myself. I was like, oh, I actually hear the scientific mindset in that. Can you say that again? It really affected me, but it set me off on like a spiral. And now I want to give you a good answer.
Sure. Quote, every time I do one of these investigations, I still get so excited. I'm 75 into them. And still, I swear on number 76, I'm going to be like, this is the one. And maybe I'm just eternally optimistic, but I hope I never lose this hope.
Now I see that I know what I was talking about, and I'd use other language to describe it. But I think what I was really saying is that I was enjoying the scientific process. Ross and I have sort of artificially created this opportunity to make our lives a laboratory. And in that environment, I am able to just briefly encounter each new paranormal claim and get all the way back to zero and be like, yeah, maybe. Okay. Yes. Let's see. Ross, let's win Nobel Prizes. I don't know. Maybe that's how this works. And then when it doesn't, the scientist in me knows that there's a backup plan, that the backup plan is that we're collecting data and we're synthesizing it and we're sending it out into the world and we're educating people and hopefully making their lives better. And so it is true that hope remains, but I also don't want to short shrift the other side of it, which is that rationality also always ends up being the solution, right? So it's okay to miss your faith. It's absolutely okay. For me, putting new faith in the scientific process and even creating it for myself so that I could see science play out, that was a really new and enriching experience that this podcast changed my life with.
And that TED Talk was in 2016. Let's go back 5 years prior to that, to March 11th, 2011, your very first episode. How many episodes, by the way, have you done by today? It's 400 and something, right?
Oh, man.
Yeah, we have released 409. We've got number 410 coming out a day or two after we have this conversation. And then there's a bunch of various like bonus episodes for subscribers to our show.
Okay, so 409 episodes ago, as of this recording on March 11th, 2011, you were recounting your second visit to the Kabbalah Center together. The first time the two of you went, the show didn't yet exist. How did you decide what to cover for your first episode out of, I imagine, the dozens of potential topics you could have delved into? And more specifically, how did you decide how to cover it? How did you first come up with the classic, oh no, Ross and Carrie approach?
We had a list. We did a brainstorming session with our friend Ian, who recorded and produced the first episode and has remained loyal and by our sides ever since, even though he moved immediately to Washington.
Wow, he was shaken up by that event.
You're right.
He had to leave the state.
Yeah, he fled. He fled, and yet he remained connected from afar, safe distance. But I remember even from when we both had that germ of an idea, like, oh, this is something that we have, because I think I had already had this desire of wanting to contribute to the literature, put something out there. I was listening to all these other shows, but I thought, well, I don't want to just be another show that kind of researches this paranormal topic and then gives my take on it. And I feel like we established three things that sort of set us apart that we could use as, I won't even say like guidelines or rules, because we don't think of them that way. I think they're just outgrowths of our personalities. But it was that we would do things ourselves. So it would be a firsthand investigation. And then it would be fun, because we were already laughing and we were being amazed at the things that were said to us. So we wanted to have fun with that. But then the third part is hopefully not at the expense of well-meaning people. I guess maybe that's the part that we have to think the most about is, what is the tone that we're presenting? And is it respectful of the people and the fact that they are just sort of mirrors of ourselves, but maybe at a different point in their sort of intellectual development? So I think that's what we early on settled on, as this is what will set us apart in our approach.
Carrie, a recurring theme of your public talks, whether it was your 2012 presentation at the Amazing Meeting conference in Las Vegas or your TED Talk, has been how to approach people with unfalsifiable beliefs with empathy. To paraphrase from your TED Talk, you say that when people are confronted with the truth of a thing, they tend to give up the ghost, so to speak, to tie it back to your experience with carbon monoxide poisoning. But some of the research that I've done on this topic shows that oftentimes the opposite is true, that conspiracy theorists, or really pretty much any of us, when we're confronted with information that goes against what our beliefs are, like if you go up to someone who, let's say, is big on gun ownership and gun rights, and you go to them and you say, hey, we've shown that in other states, if you pass this law or you pass this background check, it will actually lower the amount of gun-related deaths without infringing on your personal rights to own a gun, that in the face of that evidence, people will tend to double down. Now, I don't mean to pick on gun owners here. This applies to anyone with any kind of belief that they firmly hold as part of their own identity.
You can pick on gun owners. That's fine.
Well, I know there are a few listening to this podcast, but I think it's this universal thing, right? Whether you're a conspiracy theorist or you believe in a more mainstream religion, or you have a firmly held political belief that you believe to be true, when you encounter evidence that says otherwise, evidence that can't be debunked, evidence that is backed by science and data. Study in Psychology Today and Pew Research shows that when we're confronted with evidence, firm evidence that counteracts our own beliefs, we tend to not give up those beliefs, but in fact double or triple down. How do you approach someone with beliefs that you know are untrue and unfalsifiable with empathy when you know that there might not even be a chance that you can talk them out of it?
Oh, man. That's such a complex question, and one that we get, I think, from our listeners all the time, because they'll want to apply the principles of our show to their relationship with their dad or their cousin or someone else in their lives. And oh man, there's so many ways to break that down. But interestingly enough, it's not what we do on the show. We go into these investigations just to hear people out, and we're not in the moment. We're not raising concerns or saying, well, I guess we do offer at least, have you considered this? We'll at least want to give them questions that will bring them to the brink and force them to maybe evaluate those ideas. But just more broadly, I'll say that I mentioned cognitive dissonance theory earlier. We have different filters for parsing the world and information that we take in. And I think the strongest filters are the ones about ourselves, what interactions say about ourselves and who we are. And if you confront somebody with one of those identifiers, like you mentioned earlier, I'm Michael, I'm Armenian Irish, I'm Christian. If you say something against one of those identifiers and it makes them feel like they are either not rational or they're not a good person, they are going to reject that because that is the strongest filter. We want to preserve that sense of I am a good person, I am a smart person. And that's what you run up against. And when we put out our episodes, oftentimes we're sort of talking about someone behind their back. And it's a feature, a bug of our format, because we would give a very different presentation if we were talking to that, say, presenter at a Conscious Life Expo or something. We would have a different starting point. So sometimes if we do talk with that person, that believer, we have to take a step back and find the commonalities, the things we all definitely agree on, and slowly work our way up the pyramid to find those places that we can make progress on.
Actually, that provokes a follow-up question that I can turn to you, Carrie. But to kind of leapfrog off that, Ross, you said in a recent talk in March at Skepticamp, you were talking about how you almost always use your real names, but you don't mention the podcast or the real reason you're there in order to preserve the purity of your role as an observer and investigator. But I think this does require, as you note in the talk, withholding your honest opinion and obscuring how you might really feel about the beliefs and events that you're witnessing and taking place in. And while I'm sympathetic to that, I understand the necessity of this as it pertains to the podcast and investigative journalism as a whole. Is that something that you've ever wrestled with or continue to wrestle with, talking with someone and perhaps even connecting with them on a personal level over a length of time while pretending to be a version of yourself that is at least partially false? Carrie, I know you have a background in performance going back as far as your 1980s fictional commercials or your role in The Wiz. But do you ever feel that performing when it comes to making a potentially authentic connection with someone else, how does that make you feel in the moment?
Oh, bad. In the moment, bad. In the moment, there are aspects of a person's job that feel bad. But, you know, we're trying to balance different obligations.
You're doing it for a greater obligation, yeah.
Ross, I think, mentioned being respectful to the people we're reporting on. And that's a huge value of ours that you're reflecting on now. And another value of ours is being respectful to our audience, that they're encountering these claims in the same way that Ross and I encountered them when we were kids or adults. And I wrote down this quote that Ross said earlier, "This is a stupid story," as he was reading through his Bible. You know, not these are stupid people. What a stupid environment I've been brought up in. This is a stupid story, and I should be allowed to walk around the church and say, wait, hang on, what you are selling, the product appears to have a defect. And unfortunately, we've created these bubbles that oftentimes they are churches, but they're not always churches. These bubbles where it's inappropriate to speak that way and considered disruptive. So fine. You know, Ross and I looked at the options and said, all right, we're going to create another path, which is we're going to talk about you, as Ross said, behind your back. But, you know, if you want to be on the show on the next episode, absolutely. You were talking in public about your beliefs, and now we're talking in public about your beliefs. And if you want to come back and talk about them again a third time, 100%, come on back. But yeah, it feels bad in the moment. But when I look at the big picture, I just say, yeah, that's a really important thing for me to absorb because it's an aspect of my job that the audience relies on me for.
Rather surprisingly from that same Skepticamp talk, Ross, that I think the majority of people who you meet during these investigations don't end up learning about your podcast for whatever reason.
As far as we know, yeah.
Has there ever been a moment where maybe not a leader of a church or a cult or a flat earth or whatever, but maybe just someone you met in passing Have they ever reached out to you and been like, hey, Ross, hey, Carrie, I thought we had a real authentic moment there?
Oh,
Oh, yeah.
yeah. Some of those have made their way onto the show. And by the way, I've just got to shout out your preparation here because I can feel the weight of that preparation. Like, wow,
Totally.
how much you've dug into the things that we've said and the very relevant episodes to all of these conversation points. So kudos. I think we recognize that because we try to do that as well.
Totally.
Well, I did the prep so you don't have to.
Yes, yes. Well done. And yes, I've had those thinking moments. And I'm thinking of one in particular with David Stewart from the Amazing Facts series. He gave us the series of, I think it was like 25 lectures. I think I attended 22 of them, something like that, on the imminent coming of the end times. And we patiently listened through. We made friends with him. Being in that crowd, that sort of intimate group, because usually there were, I don't know, like 20 to 30 people. It wasn't a huge crowd. We would join potlucks with them. We would talk afterwards. And yeah, we would use kind of a neutral language in our responses because we never want to say anything that's false to who we are and what we're thinking. But we're also, like Carrie said, this is sort of a bubble that's been created. We're not here to burst it. I want your End Times lecture series to go off without a hitch. And I'm committed to that.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's going to be any trouble for me, I might ask a probing question during your Q&A if you even have one. But I'm not going to say, you know what, I think you're wrong about this. Hey, everybody, let's talk about the history of the end times and why people have been wrong with every generation about whether Jesus is coming back. I'm just not going to do that. It's a lovely conversation. I'm eager to have it. But if I'm going to have it, it's going to be at the restaurant afterwards or somewhere not in this church. So having established this friendship with all these people, they were getting my phone number, we're texting each other. David came to visit at my work. You know, I showed him around and we had a great meal there. I then had to tell him, hey, I've got to be honest with you. We've gotten so close. I was attending your series because I was interested in it genuinely, but also I have this podcast and we've been talking about it. And it was a really tough moment because I could see the pain that he was experiencing in the context of our friendship. And it took him a while to come around to the idea of, okay, I actually do want to take you up on your offer and come on the show and point out things that I think you got wrong and have a dialogue. And we did eventually do it. He was very nervous. I felt terrible for him, but he did it. And I'm so proud of him for it. Those are rare instances, but they actually end up being, I think, my favorite episodes where we get to have those follow-up conversations and do a little bit of a mea culpa on our end, but also go from someone who's feeling hurt, maybe even outraged, to finding points of agreement and reestablishing that, hey, we do still like you. We do still care about you.
Yeah, one of my favorite episodes is with the Aetherius Society, a follow-up interview with a couple of people from there who we had become close to and friends with. And they apparently, this is kind of a double spy situation. They actually knew who we were. They had Googled us. So we were being quiet about who we were and they were being quiet. And then when we released the episodes, they didn't like them. So, okay, fine. We brought them on to talk. But it was early in our career on the show, and we kind of both weren't sure how much we'd gotten wrong. We knew that we had maybe gone too long with this friendship thing without talking about the pod, but how long, I don't know. And we were still figuring it out. It also happened to fall on Ross's birthday. They were very sweet and had brought a bottle of champagne.
They brought me a gift. Yeah.
Yeah, oh my goodness, just so many social factors and competition. But additionally, I'm still feeling just the weight of this fundamental burden, which is, okay, at the end of the day, the job of the podcast is to examine the claims of your belief system. And we still haven't gotten to them, buddies. So their founder's name was George King. And I kept saying, yes, but who is George King? And why should I believe him? And they would ramble for 3 or 5 minutes and we would never get to the answer to that question. And then I'd just pull them on back. Yes, but who is George King and why should I believe them? Eventually, we just all had to drop it and become friends again and decide that we weren't going to solve this in this 1-hour conversation on microphone, which I think is the point. Ross and I see it as this isn't how change happens. When you confront someone and just say like, well, here's all the problems. Yeah, of course. That's when you get the supposed backfire effect, which I think is what the research you were alerting to earlier, Michael, is the idea that when we tell people the opposite of what they believe and they clam up, that's a very immediate effect that we see in certain environments. But over the long term, we can see very different outcomes. And actually, there's a 2021 study in PNAS about backfire effects and myths that you should look at. But yeah, I think in the end, the question is really, how confident are you in yourself as a person who has the truth? Do you really believe what you think? And if you do, and you love this person, then bring both factors into the room and do your best to switch between them and keep both jobs in mind. That's the best you can do.
Yeah, and another refrain in that conversation with the Aetherius Society members was that they had told us, you got things wrong in your podcast. And that was something that we're intensely interested in. Oh, yes, please tell us the factual things we got wrong. And we kept asking that question as well. And the answer was always sort of a pivot into a different aspect or maybe an emotional venue. But I don't think ever did they have one thing where they said, oh, you misrepresented during the ceremony. We don't actually say this 5 times. We say this instead. I don't think that's what they meant when they said you got things wrong, which of course we would have been interested in. And we do get things wrong. Of course, we want to air them. But just to buttress Carrie's point as well, people clam up in that initial conversation. And one piece of advice that we give listeners all the time when they ask us, how do I deal with this family member, this person in my life, is that you're not going to change people's deeply held beliefs in the span of one conversation. You can take all the words of the dictionary and put them in any particular order, and we all feel like there's going to be some magical permutation that will unlock the key to make them realize how wrong they are. And it just doesn't happen within the span of one conversation. You really have to play the long game. And to borrow a Christian metaphor, plant a seed and let it germinate. Let them own the ideas and come to it themselves eventually. And hopefully you're there as a resource for them and maintain enough of a friendship that they can talk to you about it again.
Yes. Carrie, you've talked about the fundamental difference between an outer truth and an inner truth. It made me start thinking about how I think for a lot of people, right, whether it's a religious belief or a cult, and I think a cult is just a religion that hasn't gotten that big, or a paranormal belief, or the example that springs to mind is that flat earther Sydney, who believed that there was a universal Mandela effect in which a malicious force was changing the details of important events like the moon landing and the geographical location of Australia and hiding it from everyone.
Yeah. Hi, Sydney.
She's unfortunately passed away since then.
Oh, that's right. I'm sorry.
But it made me start thinking, because this is a recurring theme in the podcast. French philosopher Blaise Pascal once said, quote, "There is a God-shaped vacuum in the heart of every man which cannot be filled by any created thing," end quote. And we touched on this a bit, but I went through like my angry atheist phase in my early to mid 20s after losing my religion. And I'm now like comfortably agnostic. But there's something that I've struggled with as I've gotten older, and it's been a recurring theme here, which is it feels like in the absence of religion or a religion-sized binding framework for life, that people tend to find religion elsewhere. One topic we've touched on the show several times is how politics has taken up the mantle of religion for many people in recent years, in which it goes from something that someone is interested in or even passionate about to a defining characteristic or a fundamental piece of someone's identity, in very much the same way being a Christian was a fundamental part of mine. Or you have people, and I'm speaking as someone who has been guilty of this. You have people our age who are having like religious experiences watching a new trailer for a Star Wars film.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not knocking this, because having passions and interests are like deeply important, and it really points to a universal search for meaning. But I guess the question is twofold. First of all, do you agree with the premise that there's like a factory setting hole of meaning with every human that we need to fill up with something significant in order to feel whole, whether that is ethnic identity, national identity, a passion for a particular IP or politics or whatever it is? And then the follow-up question to that, if you agree with the premise, is what can or what should we fill it with? And I guess we can start with you, Carrie, because I wanted to make at least one Star Wars reference in your honor.
Whew. Okay. Start with me on the how to fill the God-shaped hole in your life. Okay. It's 9:05 a.m. I'm on it. Hands you. Okay. I don't think I agree there's a hole when you're born. I don't know. It's not self-evidently true to me. The thing that's self-evidently true to me is that parenthood is selfish. And so when we decide to have kids, we put them in the position of suffering, and you grapple with that as a person for the rest of your existence, that you are here and you didn't ask to be. And my response to that has been my whole life to just be childless, easy. But that's not the response that most people give. And I know that. And I know that people find incredible meaning from having children. And I just accept that as similar to me finding incredible meaning from the Mary Tyler Moore Show or obsessing about psychology research. I just say that's okay, fine. But when I look at this supposed hole, I just think, you didn't ask to be here. And I can see why in your situation with a bunch of people around you who are religious or who feel different from you, or you feel like you need to fill that with community, but that's not the solution to me. The solution is like more self-knowledge, more scientific knowledge, asking more questions, hearing from more people, broadening instead of limiting the kinds of sources I listen to based on what group they belong to.
There's that famous Kurt Vonnegut quote from, I can't remember which book, but it was, tiger gotta hunt, bird gotta fly, man gotta sit and wonder why. Tiger gotta sleep, bird gotta land, man gotta tell himself he understand. And I've always deeply related to that. Because I think similar to you, Ross, when I was losing my faith, I told myself, I'm going to give both sides of this. The half of me that is pulling away and saying, I don't want to believe anything that's not true. And the half of me that is I desperately want this thing that has been so fundamentally important to me for 2 decades to be true so I don't have to lose it. For every book I would buy disproving Christianity, I'd buy another C.S. Lewis book.
Oh, we are so similar. We got to talk more, Michael. Yeah.
We can exchange dog-eared screw tape letter books. But I think it was because, at least for me, and I hear what you're saying, Carrie, and I agree. There was something that you said when we had our first conversation ahead of this podcast, a month or so ago, Ross. We're talking about how you avoid using the word skeptical or skepticism because it's synonymous with cynicism. You approach your guests with an empathy that I really admire, because I think it's easy to be cynical, especially when you're looking at some of these more fringe beliefs. But I think when you come to understand, as I think you both have, is that whether it is something like Reiki healing or Scientology or Mormonism or Sikhism, the very many large and small belief systems that you have covered, that they are all trying to get at that same Kurt Vonnegut quote, which is that we're trying to understand the world around us. It's just tough. I have so much empathy for people because I struggle with that myself.
Oh my goodness, you put such a smorgasbord of interesting ideas on the table here. It stated so many commonalities. That Kurt Vonnegut quote, I think about that a lot too. I've got a cat rubbing up against my legs right now, and I don't think she spends a lot of time thinking, why am I here? What am I supposed to do? What is my purpose? But it is kind of the burden of the prefrontal cortex and one of those spandrels of evolution where, maybe we got this big brain to help us with other survival related things. And then we get this unintended consequence of wanting to know answers to deeper questions that are popping up in our consciousness. And I love that you started with a Blaise Pascal quote, because we've mentioned him many times on the podcast, and he's someone I quote regularly, both for and against. He's one of those thinkers like C.S. Lewis or Soren Kierkegaard, where it's oh, I agree with you on so much, but oh, why did you have to say this? I disagree so strongly. I guess I would agree with the whole, but I don't think it's God-shaped, because from my personal experience and from so many people I know, you live just fine without God. And to bring up another favorite quote, the author Philip K. Dick, who wrote the story that the Blade Runner series is based on, science fiction author, he wrote, reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. And I feel for me that when I stopped believing in God, he just truly went away because he wasn't there to begin with. But in your initial question, you framed it so well, because you said it sometimes bleeds into politics, or it bleeds into social groups or fan interests. We want relationship with others. We want a sense of belonging, all those things on the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We need respect. We need security. We need, for many people, assurance that our identity, our legacy, the sunk cost of everything that we put into our lives, that will somehow matter or be meaningfully preserved for the future. And you can break all those up into their components and maybe find this piece of your belonging in one part of your life and this piece in another. But there's no one size fits all solution, because I get so excited by new knowledge and scientific findings about the world. And it's easy for me to think that like every other person I encounter on the street is going to have that same need and it'll be fulfilled. If they just read more Carl Sagan, they'd be fine. But that doesn't work for everybody. They don't get off on the same knowledge or understanding about the world. It's a little bit different for everybody. And I guess that's cool about humanity. And we all have to find different ways to make those connections and fill the hole. But the hole is real. I'll at least agree with that, Pascal.
If a truth falls in a forest, right? And no one is there to witness it. The truth is still there, lying on the moss-covered ground. But it seems like now more than ever, and maybe it's just because I haven't been alive for 100 years, but in the 40-odd years that I have been alive, it seems like our understanding of or relationship to the truth, like at a national level, it's hard to categorize myself politically these days. I'm left on some things, right on some things, but I think a defining feature of my life is that I have mostly liberal or progressive friends here in Los Angeles, but I have a lot of relatives who are conservative. And so to circle back to empathy again, that gives me empathy for both sides. But I think the frightening thing is, and I'm speaking as someone who I know is susceptible to this, and I know I'm blind to it without knowing exactly where my blind spots are, but I can recount the same exact event, if it's politically charged, to my progressive friends and my conservative family members. And if it's an event in which I know the conservatives have it right in terms of what actually happened at that event, but my progressive friends have only read progressive sources, which have skewed the reality of it, or vice versa, in which the progressive reality is correct, but the conservative sources have skewed it. No amount of me showing them evidence about the actual event itself, removed, detached from the political meaning behind it, I found it harder and harder as the years have gone on to disabuse them of the invisible dragon in the garage, of the political event that they have tied themselves to. And it feels like the oh no, Ross and Carrie of it all that started in 2011 and was for paranormal beliefs and fringe things, like that kind of thinking that you'd encounter in these episodes has kind of infected a lot of us. Not necessarily in terms of fringe beliefs and cults, but in terms of how we view reality and how we find ourselves less and less able to be talked into what actually is true.
I love that you said, it sort of infected people. I feel like what we provide with the show and what we hear most from our listeners that has impacted them is just that we have this conversation, we show our notes and say, here's why I reacted this way to what the person said, and here's what it makes me think of. And I think just showing that thought process hopefully gives people the freedom or the pathway of thought just to take something they disagree with and unpack it and look at it from many different angles and try to consider what it is the other person is seeing in that moment that we're not seeing, and try to wear their perspective just for a moment. It's sort of a mindfulness practice. If you're at least aware of these gut reactions that you're having, that's the first step. And if you can do that, if you can at least be aware of the fact that you do jump to a conclusion, that's, I think, part of the road out, is that you'll catch yourself and question, oh, why am I reacting that way? Is that factual?
To circle back to the logistical quickly, Carrie, you and Ross release an episode of the podcast about once a week, sometimes even doing 2 a week. And your episodes usually range from about 90 minutes to 2 hours. You used to release the show roughly about once a month, maybe around 15 episodes a year from 2011 to maybe June 2017. From an investigative journalism standpoint, how has your show, if it has, how has your show changed since you switched from a monthly to a weekly release schedule? Has it changed how you cover stories or even what stories you choose to investigate?
Yes, it has. I think it's less changed how we've chosen what we investigate, though maybe it should. I think we just use our passion pretty much exclusively for that. But as far as just what the product looks like as a result, I think that Ona Ross and Carrie is a show for people who want to hear the details. It is not Radiolab. It is not the show where you're like, oh, sure, I want to hear the 40-minute summary of how psychology explains the paranormal. Great, I'm out. That's the last time I listened to that for the rest of my life. Yeah, Ona Ross and Carrie is for the person who thinks that that process itself, figuring that out, is exciting and fascinating, and they want to hear every step of it. And for that person, the weekly schedule is perfect. And we release all this content. And it's this friend in your ear who also sort of models a good way to approach these kinds of claims and how to think. Those people love it. Then there are the people who are used to this other kind of format where you get a very quick bite summary that is still reliable and well sourced, and probably took that reporter and their team several months worth of person hours combined. And we're two people. So it changes the rhythm of the show. But since Ross and I are details people, we're glad to do it. That's just not a problem. We were so thrilled that people actually wanted to stick around for that level of going along with us. I don't know. It's kind of cool. It's like we have friends all the time on everything we do on a very granular level.
It's amazing that of all the feedback we get on so many different wavelengths, no one had ever said, hey, can you please make the episodes shorter? Because we know we go on too long. We're aware of that. And believe me, it's edited way down from the original. But finally, we did get one email that said, hey, I do love the show, but can you really cut it down farther? And I said, finally, somebody said it. And we haven't changed our format.
Carrie, I'd love to just read to you, I think, still one of your favorite quotes by investigative journalist Isadore Feinstein Stone. Quote, the only kinds of fights worth fighting are those you're going to lose, because somebody has to fight them and lose until someday somebody who believes as you do wins. What does this quote mean to you personally, and how do you find it informs how you approach your work?
Yeah, I love that quote. So I first encountered that quote because Jack Kevorkian said it. So Jack Kevorkian, of course, for anybody who doesn't know, was a death rights activist who was very controversial and, in his understanding, helped a lot of people to die at the end of their lives when doctors wouldn't help them. And he relayed this quote and immediately complicated it for me because of the complicated character he is. And then I found out who spoke the quote, and I learned about that person and what a complicated character he is. But I've let all of that go. And what I see in the quote is return to every question at its core. If you believe in this, go back to the question. You really think this is true? Then fight. Don't think about whether you're going to win this week or today. Don't think even about whether you're going to win in your lifetime. Document it, get it down, put it out into the ether, and trust that other people fighting for the same thing will get it to the finish line one day. And I'm doing that for, I have people on my wall who I admired who are dead. James Randi is next to me. Nellie Bly is across from me. And Arthur Miller's next to me. Marjo Gortner's behind me. He's still alive. But yeah, we're all in this together across history and time and space, fighting for the same thing. And if I got caught up in whether I win the battle today, well, goodness, certainly I'll quit. So I don't.
Ross, you said in an interview with the Huffington Post several years ago, quote, the mind of an apologist, someone who will defend the faith or the cause, so to speak, uses a lot of brain power. Usually very intelligent people are able to do this, and they find ways to justify foolish or wrong beliefs by highlighting certain aspects of the argument and focusing on this to the exclusion of others. Doing these types of mental backflips takes a lot of exercise, end quote. How would you recommend someone who might, unbeknownst to them, be exhausted from doing these mental backflips? How do they take a break, and how do they find their way out?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I feel like at least when I see someone performing those mental backflips, first of all, I'll just sort of appreciate the game and the format involved. We've broken those sorts of techniques and tactics down on the podcast many times. Oh, that's a gish gallop. And that sort of naming is, I think, important, that you at least have a quick reference point to identify such things. But I think when I see that sort of person performing those feats of mental agility, At first, I feel a kinship, like, oh, wow, hey, you're one of these people that care enough to want things to be true. It's not enough just for you to say, I believe this, we're done. You actually want to convince me. You want to appeal to universal concepts and truths that we can potentially agree on. So already I know we share a certain something that I don't share with everybody else. And then I guess maybe the thing that I can offer them, but I wouldn't do it in the conversation because it would feel demeaning and obnoxious. But just speaking to you, I would say that person can use that same mental effort in a far more productive way if they're not defending a belief, but rather searching for truth. Apologetics, the defense of a faith, is not a search for truth. It's a defense of a preconceived conclusion. So I wouldn't tell them, hey, you would be far more fulfilled in your life if you were using all of this amazing brain power you've got to pursue the truth. But at least I would see this as an opportunity for us to just go at it and let's put these ideas out on the table and let's play. Because for our investigations, like we said earlier, we don't go in to talk people out of their beliefs. But if we're having a dinner later and you pulled me aside and you asked me an honest question, you're going to get an honest answer. If you bring it, let's have that conversation. Go ahead, try to convert me, but I'm going to tell you what I honestly think in this moment. And I love that. I think that is the greatest situation. I really seek those out if I can have those conversations. They may be few and far between, but they're really satisfying.
To wrap us out, one more question each on a much lighter topic, because I put you through the ringer at, like you said, Carrie, 9 a.m. in the morning. You both live such active, busy lives outside of this podcast, which we didn't really get a chance to touch on. I could have easily talked with both of you for another couple of hours. Ross, you work in animation at Disney. You participate in the Center for Inquiry Investigations group. Carrie, you're studying psychology at the Harvard Extension School, and you're writing a book about psychological trauma. You co-host another podcast called Hidden Mickeys, about the weird, obscure, mysterious, and lesser-known side of Disney.
Also weekly.
There we go. Final question for you, Ross. In 2015, you recalled 600 places of pie. In 2022, you recited 3,200 places of pie. Will you make another attempt?
Yes, I will. Absolutely. I plan to keep at it until I displace the number one record in America, which is, I want to say 16,600. That's my goal. If I get number one in the US, I can let my laurels rest until someone comes to challenge me, like that King of Kong documentary. So yes, it is an ongoing pursuit and very irrational.
If you're able to do it while hacky sacking, that will be a feat worth...
A feat involving feet.
A feat involving feet. Carrie, I know that one of your dreams has been to meet Dick Van Dyke. Now, I know you saw him in the front row when he performed in 2017. Have you yet fulfilled your dream of meeting him?
I haven't. No, I wish. I am the number one. I swear this is true, but it hasn't happened yet. But I guess I've met him in the sense that I watch the Dick Van Dyke Show almost every day. And I wish that Ross had been giving out Dick Van Dyke Show quotes at the Center for Inquiry, but I will settle for Simpsons quotes if that's what's on avail.
To end, you were both very kind to allow me to reschedule this podcast, and I wanted to touch on that briefly. My wife, Anne, and I, we met for the first time in January of 2009. We shared a screenwriting class at USC together. We barely interacted, but we met again on Hinge many, many years later.
Wow.
How cool.
But 3 months before we met, Anne adopted a 2-month-old dog named Darcy in October of 2008. And I had the pleasure of meeting Darcy in November of 2022. 3 months after he turned 14. And I watched him sprint after squirrels in the backyard that Anne bought for him until he was nearly 16 years old when we had to put him to rest 2 weeks ago. So I just wanted to say, Carrie, that I was very moved by your eulogy for Ella. And to use your turn of phrase, we are very lucky gods indeed. So thanks for, thanks for writing that. I read it to Anne and we both really connected with it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm so sorry. Dogs are, like so special, so unique, and they don't get to talk for themselves. So let's give them their moments sometimes. Like, what other species is like that reflects you back to you in such a pure way and shows you how much you're capable of and the kind of attention and adoration that you can give someone else. And I bet this is the thing that parents get that I was biologically not given. that relationship is so reciprocal and so beautiful. And I'm so glad you had it.
Oh, me too. And we have 3 other amazing dogs. It's a veritable zoo in here.
Oh, good. Good.
To go back to that Kurt Vonnegut quote, and I know you both have cats. When you look at an animal, whether it's a dog, a cat, a bird, a tiger, etc., I look at a dog playing in a dog park with all these other dogs and just going moment to moment. And I think, man, for all the years of therapy and for all the religious struggle that I've had, all I'm trying to do is get to what they do naturally. And I think there's a deep truth there connected to your podcast. So I want to end with a quote from a recent Apple Podcast review. Quote, Ross and Carrie are just skeptical enough, cynical enough, kind enough, honest enough, funny enough, and intelligent enough to keep me tuning in each week. And to end with something you said, Carrie, because I think it's very poetic. I love that you teach and show others how to make our lives a laboratory, to stay ever inquisitive, ever curious, ever empathetic, and ever adventurous. So thank you both for the 13 years you have put into this podcast. I can't wait to see, to use a turn of phrase, where you go next. And thank you so much for tackling the deep questions with us today. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Michael.
100%. What a wonderful interview. Thank you, Michael.
It was my pleasure.